Now coming to tonight's session 2, I'm excited, happy to now welcome Mr. Sai Satish Vedam again, the moderator of this session. Mr. Vedam is the Chief Product Officer, Executive Coach, and Senior Faculty at the Institute of Product Leadership. He was most recently the Senior Director of Product Management at Oracle. Great to have you here, Mr. Vedam. Please take over the session 2.
Thank you, Shama. For those of you who are continuing with us, hello again. For those of you who are joining for this session, welcome. It's been exciting 2 days, amazing topics, superb speakers, great insights from every session practically, and particularly thrilled about the way audience is engaging by asking really interesting questions. So please continue to do that. And again, please ask those questions if you are on Zoom on the Q&A window. If you are joining us on LinkedIn live stream, please ask those questions in that stream. Don't ask the questions in the chat window, otherwise they get lost in the chatter. So before I introduce Neeraj Sane, Neeraj, can I have you on video just to make sure that we all can see you and you are here?
Hi, Sai Satish. Are you able to see me?
Yes. Hello. Hopefully you can see us
Yes.
as well. Great. Thank you so much for joining, Neeraj. Let me introduce you to the audience, and then I'll talk a little bit about who might be our audience, right? And so for those of you joining, Neeraj is head of strategy, is a director at Facebook, head of strategy and insights at Facebook. Now, I can only say that Neeraj has a very eclectic journey, right? I think he's been a generalist, experienced in strategy, data science, brand management. How eclectic can that get? And of course, worked in interesting companies other than Facebook, in eBay, Coke, Colgate, and New Sigma, right? So that is quite a journey, Neeraj, and I'm sure there are some interesting stories along the way, hopefully you can share with us. Neeraj is also an avid aviation enthusiast. I'll connect with you separately on that, Neeraj. And proclaimed pop culture fanatic, can go on discussing TV shows or movies. What's your favorite TV show right now that you're watching on Netflix or Prime or whatever?
It's really hard to choose, but I recently, it'll sound boring, but there's a show called Grand Designs, which is basically about folks who are trying to build their dream homes. What I love about the show is just the narration and the beautiful way in which the host describes how the homes are built. But yeah, I watch a bunch of stuff.
Sometimes the mundane things are made exciting by people who make that, and we just get hooked onto it.
That's right.
Thanks for that. Now, your favorite quote is when you identify a problem, don't tolerate it. It's amazing. That's beautiful. It also sounds very ruthless, though. But I guess we've got to be that, sometimes in our professional career. Welcome again. Thanks for joining. But before we get started with your session, I thought it'll be useful to understand who our audience is, right? So I have 3 polls for our audience here, and they've been a sweet audience taking these polls in previous sessions, but not the same questions. So folks who've been taking, don't worry, these are 3 different questions now. So let's understand what kind of products do you come from, right? So whether you work in engineering, product role, or sales or marketing, whichever you're joining from, please go ahead and take those and tell us more about where you are today, the kind of companies, the kind of jobs, the kind of activities that you do. And hopefully, Neeraj can look at this, get some insights, and probably put more emphasis on some things that might be more relevant, or less emphasis on things that may not be relevant for this audience today, right? So that's good. So it looks like a majority from software, and that too in enterprise software, which is nice always. I'm an enterprise guy. I love enterprise products, but often we all get enamored by the consumer products. Let's get to the next one, Shama. So it looks like there are only about 50% polling going on. Again, folks, just go ahead and choose one of these. What are you doing? What are the activities that you perform? Now, of course, many of us are doing many of these things. So go ahead and choose, as many as you do. clearly, there are things that we do that we don't like, but we have to do being in the context of an organization. Good, interesting results here. I'm actually surprised that you only have about 22-24% people saying navigating internal politics. I was expecting a lot more than that. But it's good news. If you're not spending time doing that, you're spending the time doing something else. Thank you for that. So the last one. Okay, so if you are in product roles, and that role doesn't necessarily have to be as a title of product manager, but somebody who performs the roles and responsibilities of managing products, either engineering leadership or product marketing or sales leadership, any of those in the context of products, of course. So how did you get to become familiar, become equipped with those skills, and are able to do that, right? Some of us jump into it without knowing what it is, struggle, learn through mistakes, and try to help others not to make the same mistakes. Okay, that's a good. I think that's a good set of responses there. Thank you guys for taking this. Hopefully, Neeraj, this is of some use for our conversation today. Over to you.
Certainly. Thank you, Sai Satish. Let me just share my screen. All right, is the screen visible?
Yep.
All right, thank you. So hello, everyone. I'm Neeraj. It's a real pleasure to be here. I hope you're all well and staying safe wherever you are. First of all, a big thanks to the Institute of Product Leadership for this opportunity to share my thoughts on this subject. And of course, oh, I'm sorry. That's tech issues as usual. And of course, a big thanks to all of you for taking the time to attend the session. So let's jump right into it. 5 principles for building strategy in uncertainty. So many of you will be familiar with this picture. And for me, it's just another example of how dynamic our world feels today, right? I mean, we've all heard the statement that now sounds almost like a cliche, that the pace of change is accelerating. And I've heard viewpoints on both sides of this argument. But honestly, from my perspective, I do perceive the pace of change to be accelerating. I mean, who would have thought that a beached shipping container in the Suez Canal, a route that services 10% of the world's trade and could potentially cause huge supply chain ripple effects that affect entire nations. I mean, these days, it just feels like another day. Here are 3 other events, and there are many, many more, but they're just 3 examples of events that are just disrupting or roiling industries and making it really hard for them to respond strategically. I don't need to belabor the effect of COVID. I mean, we've all been suffering through it for the past year plus. But the one thing I did want to say is COVID has genuinely accelerated trends that existed even before the pandemic. Especially, it has accelerated digital adoption. What that means is it has brought new types of customers into the fold who may not have been your typical customers before who may not have been typical customers before the pandemic. And they may have fundamentally altered the expectations or their expectations in terms of what they demand from your products or services. You have natural disasters that happened at a ridiculous pace in 2020, and they affected everything from, it forced companies to rethink everything from operations and supply chain all the way to their branding and marketing strategies. The third trend or event that I want to talk about is the effect of geopolitics, for instance. Companies, I'm glad, are getting involved in socially relevant discussions around race and inequality, but sometimes these end up becoming no-win situations for them because they are discovering that their customer bases have become politically polarized. So it's really hard to start building strategies for a polarized customer base. Geopolitics also plays a role in terms of the opportunities that you have access to as an organization. I mean, there's uneven access where some companies can play in certain markets and other companies are shut out of those markets. So you can see how complicated the world is getting. So given all of this, how might we think about building strategy when we have these momentous forces of change? So I was thinking about this topic, and I remembered this meme that I encountered a couple of months ago, and I thoroughly enjoyed. But the more I think about it, I was looking at each of the characters that Tom Hanks plays in these movies, and uh, they're inspirational, right? So, for example, my life goal would be to manage change and uncertainty, like Captain Sullenberger, who landed his Airbus in the middle of the Hudson River in New York, or Frank Lovell, who was the commander of Apollo 13, who prevented a human tragedy in space, or maybe even Captain Phillips, who kept a cool head and saved the lives of his crew right in the middle of a pirate attack, right? So I think the one word I will use to describe all of these characters that Tom Hanks plays, and of course I agree with the meme, I will never travel with him, but is how do you build the kind of resilience? How do you build resilient strategies and strategies that that can overcome change? But before we get into the principles, I wanted to take some time to frame the problem. I mean, this is a situation many of us are probably familiar with. This is a situation I have occasionally encountered in my professional life as well. I mean, let's think about it. You have a well-established company, or a well-established organization. It has its own routines and processes, and it has its own culture. It has its own way of doing things. And the rationale often is, why do we need to change what we're doing? I mean, it has worked for us in the past. So by extrapolation, why wouldn't it work for us in the future? But there is a critical flaw in that thinking. I mean, if you consider how those routines and processes were instituted, they often happened in the face of change. I mean, one form of change could be the company found itself in the middle of a completely new business opportunity. It was the first mover in a completely new space, and it had and using that first mover advantage, it was able to build this culture, these routines, and these processes. But the fact is, no two waves of change are alike, and so it's really important to have an open mindset and be open to learning new things and to adapt the way we do things. So, how do we change this picture from this to this? So like this, to me, this is our future desired state. So how can we organize our strategic approach and our organizations so that we are impervious to change and uncertainty? The other takeaway that's important to me on this chart is, as we think about building strategy, or we think about principles for building strategy, the actual strategy is just 10% of the impact. The remaining 90% comes from solid execution. So although the rest of this presentation is focused primarily on those 5 strategic principles, I will also share some execution principles that I've learned over the course of my career that go hand in hand with these strategic principles. So let's go ahead and take a look at these 5 principles, and a few thoughts and caveats before I jump into that. These are principles that I have been fortunate enough to learn over the course of my career that has spanned CPG, tech, retail, e-commerce, and manufacturing. I've been very lucky to work with world-class strategists, and I'll be honest, like, these principles aren't just the result of successes. There are initiatives or strategic initiatives that have succeeded and failed, and both have been incredible sources of learning for me in equal measure. The other caveat here is that the 5 principles aren't the only principles that work in times of change. I'm sure all of you have your own learnings as well from your professional careers. And after the session is over, I'd love to engage with you to learn some of your principles and engage with some of your learnings. So let's talk about the first principle. I think it might seem pretty obvious, but I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this. It's very important when you find yourself in the middle of a lot of change, or you find yourself in the middle of a dynamic environment, to avoid the false certainty that comes with projections and forecasts. I mean, honestly, forecasts are pointless when the world around you is shifting. Instead, you should try and divide that uncertainty, or break that uncertainty down into scenarios. And so I've chosen an example from an article by McKinsey, which looks at the impact on the domestic GDP of a particular country based on the public health response and based on the economic policy response. So if you were to break down how these scenarios were created, they basically looked at 2 factors that are causing, that are instrumental in managing this change and are out of their control. Like, if you're a company or an organization in this country, you are most likely not responsible for the public health response. You're probably not in charge of the economic policy response either. So these are factors that are completely out of your control. But what this framework allows you to do is think about, in this case, 9 particular ways in which, or 9 ways the world might look in the future. And so what this does is building these scenarios helps you define the boundaries of your uncertainty. Now, having said that, it's not very useful to sit around planning for 10, 15, 20 scenarios, because by the time you're done planning, the world has changed again. So it's important to kind of learn how to prioritize these scenarios. Although there are 9 scenarios here, a good rule of thumb is think about planning your strategies for not more than 4 to 5 scenarios at a time. And one of the ways in which you can prioritize is think about which scenarios are more probable or more plausible than others. I mean, everything is possible, but not everything is equally probable. A good rule of thumb to do that is to work backwards from an outcome and say, okay, for example, if I find myself, what is the probability that I will find myself in scenario 1? Well, I could find myself in scenario 1 if the government changes its policy from X to Y. What are the chances that the government is going to change its policy from X to Y? Very low or zero. Then I don't need to worry about scenario number 1 at all. So you can use this what do you need to believe framework to kind of prioritize the scenarios that you should be planning for. The next thing that's important in scenario planning is to identify which scenarios are actually good for you in terms of the business that you're in, and which scenarios might be harmful to you in terms of the business that you're in. And once you've arranged them in terms of least to most preferred scenarios, the last, or at least the next step, is to think about what are you actually going to do. So for example, if you find yourself in the middle of scenario X, what are the kinds of actions you're going to take to move the industry or move your business towards something that is more favorable to you? I don't have it up on the chart here, but I just wanted to share a very simple and useful framework. I believe this is from McKinsey, in terms of thinking about the different types of moves or actions you can make in the context of a scenario. So the first kind of move is a no regrets move. For example, it's investing more money in your existing business and operations. For example, hiring more sales staff or in making more marketing investments. It's low risk and low return. The second kind of move that you can make in any scenario is options. So you give yourself permission to play in spaces that are new, they're emerging. So you could have an option that helps you hedge your business, your current business, or you could have an option that gives you the opportunity for future growth. So it has the potential to have it is low risk, but it has the potential to have high reward. And then the third kind of move you can make in any scenario is big bets. And just as the name conveys, you're basically betting the farm on something that you think is not only going to happen, but you are aggressively moving the industry towards that outcome. And that is typically a high risk, high reward kind of move. The last point I want to make on this chart in terms of scenarios, it's important for you to define markers or metrics that indicate when you find yourself in the middle of a particular scenario. It's okay to do this exercise academically on paper, but it's pointless if you don't really know which scenario you are in the middle of at any given point of time. So it's important to define the boundaries of each scenario in terms of metrics. The second principle I wanted to talk about is relevant when you find yourself in the middle of a situation that is uncertain for almost everyone. So I'll give an example. For me, a situation of high uncertainty was the middle of last year. I would say the July-August timeframe, when we were deep in the middle of the pandemic. There was no clarity on when we will have a vaccine. There was no clarity. We knew that the virus was mutating, and there was no clarity on what form the virus will take or what path the pandemic will take. And consumers themselves were not sure in terms of what they expected what they expect the outcome to look like. So you're operating in a situation where everything seems uncertain. So if you're in a situation like that, a good principle is to find your strengths or identify 1 or 2 things that your company or your product is really good at, and just bet bold. And the reason why it's important to bet bold in these kinds of scenarios is, everyone else is still figuring it out. No one has an answer. And it's likely that if you make a bold bet, you have an opportunity to shape the future of the industry. You have an opportunity to shape the future of your product or the category that you operate in. And everybody is actually actively looking for directions. So this is an example that I find interesting. This is from an article from 2 or 3 weeks ago about GE, and it's a company that I greatly admire. As you can read from the snippets that I posted here, they basically sold off their financial services arm, which is GE Capital, and they're doubling down on manufacturing. So they're only going to focus on businesses that are pertinent to manufacturing. And I'm sure nobody here disagrees that GE is very, very good at making things. So I like this example because it not just shows you that a company that is so tenured and it is so storied finds itself in the middle of tremendous uncertainty and change. It finds itself in the middle of a big crisis. But what they've done is they've taken a bold bet and decided to focus on only the things that they do really, really well. The other reason why I like this example is it's a bit of a counter example. Making a bold bet doesn't necessarily mean you need to do more things. Sometimes it can just means you need to do less things. You just need to do things that you're really good at and stop doing things that are not your core competence. The third one is about experimenting. And to me, it's like don't be afraid to dip your toes in emerging spaces, especially business areas that are adjacent to your product. New and emerging spaces or spaces that have a tailwind of consumer trends behind them. Ensure that you are experimenting in these spaces actively because it helps you reserve the right to play in spaces that are trending. Making these small investments can have outsized effects in the future because some of these growing categories or these growing product features, for instance, or benefits or unmet needs that are beginning to emerge could completely reshape the future of your industry. So it's helpful to have your finger in a few different pies. It doesn't necessarily mean you go chasing after every opportunity. So you should be mindful in terms of which opportunities you are prioritizing. But it is important to experiment outside of your core business area all the time. It's also important to set very clear exit criteria. So, and you have to avoid the sunk cost fallacy. It is a very basic human tendency. Because we've invested X amount of money in this initiative, we really want it to work, so we should continue investing Y dollars more. Avoid that tendency by setting very clear exit criteria to say, if this initiative does not achieve the following KPIs in so many years or in so many months, we are going to exit this particular experiment. So the example that I have over here is from Coke. The particular category here is called value-added dairy in the beverage industry. And it had been identified as a very fast-growing, positive consumer trend industry as early as 2015 or 2016. And Coke made a minority investment in Fairlife, which is a company that makes enriched milk, I think a couple of years later, around 2018. And clearly that bet worked out. It's a big profit driver. It is a new line of business, and Coca-Cola completed their acquisition of Fairlife in 2020. This is something that is a very interesting example to me. I've been tracking it pretty closely. And the way I articulate it is to say, when you're in the middle of change and when things are shifting around you, think about doing things differently, not necessarily just doing different things. So I'll take an example of a new upstart electric vehicle manufacturer. I'm deliberately not taking any of the brand names at this point, but you'll see the interior of their flagship vehicle at the top of this chart. And you'll see the response, an electric vehicle from a legacy automaker at the bottom of this chart. Now, why I find this example interesting is when this electric vehicle startup or this electric vehicle company first entered the automotive industry, they entered with zero. Like they had absolutely no credence, they had no history in the industry, and it was positioned as a form of disadvantage. But I actually think it was a huge advantage for them, because they were able to design an automotive experience from the ground up. And the way they thought about creating an automotive experience is to make it technology-led and very user-centric. So if you look at the way the layout has been created, you still have the basic functions. I mean, you can still drive the car. There's a steering wheel, there is a display that kind of gives you all of the basics in terms of the mileage and your electric charge and your battery. There are a couple of manual switches on the side to help you operate the mirrors and the windows. And it has a brake and an accelerator, which is what you would expect from a car. But if you think about all of the, in your standard car, there is a proliferation of features. It almost like, if you look at the picture at the bottom of the screen, it almost looks like an aircraft cockpit, right? You have switches on the center console, you have switches on the sides, you have switches on the windows, you have these little knobs and noggles, and you have lights everywhere. It's almost like you're flying a plane. And that is a function of the legacy. I think it harkens back to the legacy design that is of automakers, which this new EV company did not have to be constrained by. So they went ahead and created a completely new experience and said, we're not going to have any of these, toggles and switches and little buttons and this very distracting layout. We're going to take all our functions and our frills and our add-on and put them into this giant screen that you see in the middle of the console. So you can see the difference in design philosophy is because they were approaching automotive design with a completely different mindset. The second point of difference I want to highlight here is the fact that they claim, in their marketing materials, but it is true in a way that you can consistently improve the experience of driving the car not only in terms of improving efficiency, but also adding new kinds of features to your car to improve your driving experience. And the cost of doing that is actually quite low because it's all driven by software. Your upgrades or your new features, your functionalities or games or what have you, everything is transferred over the air. You just connect your car to Wi-Fi and you have a new feature or functionality that you can start to play with, or you can improve the performance of your car. Now, contrast that with what's happening at the bottom of the screen, and I'm not making this up. This particular car has to be driven to the dealership for a software upgrade every time. So you can see that your upgrade costs are not low in the case of the legacy automaker. And in fact, if you want to improve the performance of your vehicle or you want to improve your driving experience beyond a certain threshold, you might just have to sell your car and buy a new one. So your net cost of upgrading is very high when you think about the electric vehicle that comes from the legacy auto manufacturer versus what you see at the top of the screen, because the mindset with which they designed the car is completely different. And the third point I wanted to highlight over here is the fact that the new EV startup or the electric vehicle company that I'm talking about has the opportunity to scale their recurring revenue. For instance, it's not inconceivable to me to think of an app store where developers can create, depending on how well they understand the car and its functionality, developers can create apps that add cool features to the car. They further improve or enhance the performance of the car, and the car manufacturer basically takes a healthy cut of the revenue. So you can see that it's think of the analogy in terms of what the App Store did for Apple's business. And that is why I sometimes joke with my colleagues that this car is almost like an iPhone on wheels. It's a moving platform that can be a solid revenue stream for the company in the future. Now, contrast that again with the legacy automaker at the bottom of the screen. Their opportunity to scale their recurring revenue is limited because you not only have to drive it into a service center to get your upgrades and pay for them, but you need to service your car, and that also has to be physically driven into a service center. So their opportunity to scale their revenue is limited. So that's why I wanted to kind of bring up these 3 points and showcase why, when you're in the middle of disruptive change, it is sometimes important to do things differently rather than just doing different things. The final principle, and this it's one of the more softer aspects of building strategy, is to be authentic. Consumers are not fools. So as you think about adjusting your business strategy or coming up with new product features or entering a completely new line of business that you think is very complementary to you, consumers can pick up on stuff that is not aligned with your core mission, your core values, or what your company actually stands for. So the example that I'm showing over here is a little tongue-in-cheek, but I think I'll be able to make the point. So I'm a fan of the original Superman movie. I don't know how many of you have seen it, but for me, the premise of Superman is that the purpose of the tale is to convey a sense of hope and optimism. For me, it was always, and you can see that in the way the movie was shot. It's got humor. It's bright. It's well lit. There's a lot of campy dialogue, but there's a lot of action. It's just basic through and through entertainment, but there is a good strong foundation underneath it, which is, there is always a tale of hope and optimism that we can embrace. Now, contrast that with its remakes recently, like Man of Steel and Batman and Superman. I'm not sure if any of you have seen those movies, but if you have, you'll appreciate the difference that I'm pointing out. Their entire tone was dark. It ended up going in a completely different direction. It became very gritty, realistic, almost fatalistic, and it moved away from the core purpose of what the Superman franchise was supposed to be. And I'm not just making this up. You can see it in the Rotten Tomatoes ratings for each of the movies. So as I was mentioning, consumers aren't fools. So when you think about making a change or think about adapting your business to change, ensure that you're not straying very far away from the core of what your company is supposed to be. The other reason why you don't want to do that is you might inadvertently enter very unfamiliar or very risky spaces where it turns out you don't actually have the capability to win against the competition. So before I proceed, I just want to quickly situate ourselves. So I've covered 5 broad principles in terms of building strategy. What I'm going to do next is share a hypothetical, a fictional case study, which will hopefully help you see how these 5 principles can be brought together in terms of actually building strategy. So let's take this hypothetical case study of what I call a company at a COVID crossroad. For me, the COVID crossroad is specifically July, August timeframe last year, as I was describing, where no one had any idea what was going to happen or what the future was going to look like. So here are the facts of the case. We're talking about an online real estate marketplace. It is an industry leader. It is the biggest player in that space. And their primary revenue comes from online advertising and sponsored real estate listings. Now, the model has done very well for them for a couple of reasons. They have a huge customer base, which translates into impressions and high ad revenue. But they also have an automatic home value estimator, which has been proven, and for the sake of argument, let's assume that it has been reliably proven accurate. And so what that does is it's become a core strength for this company, and it has given them a lot of credibility to such an extent that they are now the starting point for a majority of home searches. So they're literally the front door to real estate in their industry if you're thinking about buying or selling a home. So far, so good. But what they've noticed over the last couple of years is the emergence of a new trend called iBuying. I honestly think they should be calling it iSelling, because that's really what it's all about. But in a nutshell, iBuying is essentially where a seller sells their home to an intermediary, like another company, directly for cash, minus some repair costs based on an assessment of the home. And then the home is sold to the next buyer without the seller's involvement. Now, this is a big deal, because if anyone has sold a home, you know that the home sometimes, you have to list it, you have to stage it. Sometimes the home stays on the market for many, many days, and then you have to negotiate with the seller. So it's a very convenient way of kind of, getting rid of your house and having cash on hand to go and make your next purchase or do whatever you want to do with it. The problem with iBuying is that it's so far been pretty unprofitable. Not very unprofitable, but it's very hard to make money with the iBuying business model. To the credit of this company, they actually have been experimenting with iBuying. They saw the trend, they decided to dip their toes in it, and they've been running a small experiment on the side, and they realized that even in that experiment, they're not really making any money. The problem is that COVID happened. And because of COVID, apparently this trend has accelerated, and you're seeing more and more consumers preferring to sell their homes through the iBuying route rather than the traditional realtor route. And this has really become a problem for the company, because they started noticing that their ad revenue has declined because traffic is getting diverted to competitive websites that are offering more iBuying options. So they went out and commissioned some research studies, and it indicates that sellers actually prefer iBuying, not just because it's convenient, as I described above, but it's more hygienic. The problem is no one is clear. Remember, we're at the COVID crossroads. No one is clear whether this trend is going to be permanent, or where is this thing going to, how is the dust going to settle, and what that final version of real estate going to look like, or what is the real estate market going to look like when the dust settles. So what should the company do? Like, what are its strategic options, given these are the facts of the case? So it's a bit of an eye chart, but I'm going to help you walk through it. Uh, what I've tried to do here is create a very, very simplified example of strategy development for the case that I've just described. But you'll see all of the arrows with the numbers on it. Those indicate all of the principles that I just walked through. So there were 5 principles that I walked through, and I've created this hypothetical case to show you how those 5 principles can help you get to a strategic decision. So the first principle is, because you find yourself in the middle of uncertainty, don't think about forecasts and projections, but think about scenarios. So I have created a very simple set of scenarios in terms of what the real estate market might look like after the pandemic. So there are 3 possible views of the world, in my opinion. One is, it could return back to normal, like it would return back to the status quo where iBuying is no longer a thing. Or you can have a middle of the road option where everybody settles down and there is a stable mix of iBuying and traditional methods in real estate, online real estate. Or you have the very high likelihood that the industry is going to continue to pivot towards iBuying in a big way. And in fact, your online real estate marketplace transactions are predominantly going to happen through iBuying. So the next step that I spoke about in terms of scenarios is weeding out the scenarios that are less likely. So why do I think a return to status quo is unlikely? Well, for a couple of reasons. Even before the pandemic, the facts of the case stated that even before the pandemic, iBuying was already a trend which the company was experimenting with. So it's very unlikely to think that once COVID is finished, consumers will just completely reverse their preferences and go back to only the traditional ways of buying and selling their homes. So returning back to status quo is not a scenario that we need to really care about. But the remaining 2, which is either there is a mix of methods or there is only iBuying, are quite possible. So our job as this real estate, online real estate marketplace, is to think about what are the actions we can take for both these scenarios. And what I've done with the actions is, again, show you different kinds of actions that you can take depending on the risk, the risk return profile of each action. So there are 5 that I've given as an example. Obviously, these are overly simplified, but let me walk you through the first one. So the lowest risk, lowest return way for this company to continue operating their product is to increase the depth of their revenue, which is to say, find more ways of making money within their current business model. So they can do this in many ways. They can increase the amount of ad inventory that they have on their website. They could charge more for their ads. I mean, or they can even take a commission on sales that agents close through leads on the website. They can do basic things like increase their marketing investment, drive more traffic to the website, and hence, keep boosting their ad revenue. But the problem with all of these moves is that it's just a short-term fix against what's happening with iBuying. Even if you find yourself in the second scenario where there is a stable mix of iBuying and traditional methods, remember, iBuying is not yet profitable. So the company is going to continue to lose money. So this is trying to put bandage on a very large wound. So it's not necessarily a great action or a great strategic option for this company to think about. The second thing they can do is, okay, if it's not within our current business model, maybe we can diversify our revenue streams and extend to other types of businesses that are closer to what we do. So as a hypothetical, this is a real online real estate website. They are able to showcase homes. You're able to browse pictures in detail. They are able to see details of the homes. You're able to contact the seller and so on and so forth. So the tech stack and the design and the product outline, the product itself can be adapted to start listing short-term rentals like VRBO and Airbnb. So you basically extend your core business into short-term rentals. So is that and that will help you increase the breadth of your revenue. But is that something that is advisable? No, it's not advisable for a couple of reasons. And these link back to the principles that I was talking about. First of all, it is inauthentic with your stated purpose. Like if you're an online real estate marketplace and you can read all of their missions and their purpose and what they stand for, it's all about giving you helping you settle down in life. Like buying a home or selling a home is a very big life event, right? So they're approaching their business with that purpose. When you extend your business into something that is a short-term rental, it is inauthentic with that purpose, and it does not fit with the core of what your company is. So that's the first reason why you should not be doing that. The second reason you should be doing it is to operate successfully in short-term rentals requires a completely different mindset shift. If you think about what Airbnb has done, they have created like the short-term rentals are now a lifestyle category, whereas I think of real estate as a life goal category. So the way the consumer expectations in both these situations are completely different. So even though your engineering, product, marketing, design lift required to start listing short-term rentals is low, it's not only inauthentic, it is not good. It is not a good business decision because consumers are not going to interact with you that way, right? So that's the reason why increasing revenue breadth is probably not a good option. Then there's option number 3. You are already investing in iBuying. You could just increase the extent of investment in iBuying because that's going to give you a finger in both pies. But the problem is you really need to do that in a careful way because you're already losing money. So one way of doing that is to probably focus on a narrower segment of customers or a narrower segment of homes that are likely to sell very quickly. So if you don't have to hold the home on your balance sheet for a long period of time, and if you're able to cut costs through different efficiencies, ways of driving efficiencies, you're probably going to be able to start driving some profit in iBuying. So it's more of a middle of the road balanced option, which is a likely option for this company to take. And then the last one I'll ignore the acquisition one. I'll move all the way to the right, which is the high risk, high return move that this company can make is to pivot completely to iBuying. This is a big risk that the company is going to take because it's unprofitable, but they are actually best positioned to make this change because they are not only the biggest, they are the industry leaders. And so they have the opportunity to shape the future of this industry and lean heavily into iBuying. But at the same time, they have a core strength, which is their value estimator. So for instance, they can improve the iBuying experience by telling sellers, we know exactly what your home is worth. We will give you the true value of your home minus our cut, whatever it is. It could be a commission, it could be a flat fee. I'm not sure how they want to price it. And at the same time, because of their scale, they can create very strong vertical integration to lower costs and set the standard for the industry. Is this a very, very risky move for this website to make? Absolutely. But can they make it? And is the chance of a reward very high? Absolutely. So you'll notice that I'm not necessarily recommending one move over the other. It's a subjective call. It depends on your company's balance sheet. It depends on your risk appetite. But this is to give you an example of how strategy can be built in a particular scenario that is very uncertain, and how these 5 principles can help you think about making the right decision. So the case that I walked you through was hypothetical because obviously it was overly simplified, but the outline or the premise of the case is not hypothetical. So what I was describing is actually happening today with this website called Zillow. It's the industry leader, it's online real estate marketplace. And reading through their strategy, my assessment is that they are pivoting to iBuying in a very, very big way. And it's a huge risk, but they're willing to take it because they have the scale and they have a core strength, which is the Zestimate. So I've covered 5 principles for strategy. I have hopefully been able to illustrate how these principles can be applied in your day-to-day with a case study. But I also wanted to spend a little bit of time thinking about, or at least talking about execution. So there are some principles for execution that go hand in hand with building strategy. And I'm going to cover this very quickly because we may be running short of time. But 3 things matter to me. I think when everything is changing around you, you should try and be as close to the consumer as possible and do your best to get consumer feedback in quick, timely experiments. So a few principles in terms of getting consumer signals is ensure that you have foundational consumer insights like psychographics and needs-based segmentations. Why this is important is because needs don't change as quickly as solutions. So you may see the industry changing around you, but your core consumer needs are not likely to change at the same rate. It's also important if you have access to behavioral data to continue mining behavioral data. But it's not advisable to rely on behavioral data alone because you're missing the why. You're missing the reason why consumers are doing what they're doing. So it's important to ensure that you are not just relying on behavioral data, but you have access to more foundational consumer insights. In terms of how you build your organization, I'm preaching to the choir. This may seem very obvious, but I wanted to highlight the importance of doing that because I have seen this in teams that have been successfully executing strategies. it happens when you have the ability to do it in the form of small cross-functional teams, which also means that you need to be able to delegate your decision making effectively. I also believe in the value of translators. Translators to me are tenured or seasoned employees who have cross-functional expertise across multiple domains, and they are really critical to ensuring successful strategy implementation because they're able to move information, knowledge, and decision making quickly across teams. And the last point I want to make on organization is shared resources are critical. Like, don't be possessive about your budget. Don't be possessive about your headcount. When you're in the middle of a crisis, everyone has to pool together and keep a little bit of flex for experimentation. The last thing I want to talk about is the orientation or the mindset with which you approach your strategic problems. I mean, purpose is extremely important. It is not just a good-looking statement that you draft for your investor releases. If you're very purpose driven, you make your decisions, the big decisions and the small decisions, grounded in your purpose. It actually fosters a sense of shared ownership across the entire organization, and you'll be surprised at how easy it is to get strategic initiatives to execute well. Build a culture of high performance. You definitely need high performing individuals to help you execute strategy, but empathy is also important. Do not tolerate brilliant jerks. You will get a lot of short-term advantage, but there is guaranteed long-term damage. Ensure that you have very clear values defined for how you interact with your consumers and how you interact with each other. And incentivize positive culture creation and living values as part of your performance appraisals. And the last point I wanted to make is I personally dislike the term data-driven. I don't like to be data-driven. I think hypotheses are far more interesting and important than data, because data can sometimes be misleading in terms of the findings that you get from it. So it is more important to be hypothesis-driven than data-driven. So just to recap, before I close, scenarios are your friend. When you're in very uncertain situations, leverage your strengths and make bold bets. Don't be afraid of experimenting in emerging spaces. Do things differently, not just different things, and don't stray too far from your purpose. And with that, I'll pass it back to Sai Satish.
Wow, Neeraj, I think you just gave us a masterclass in not just how do you think about strategy, the 5 principles, but also going to prescriptive ways of execution, right? So what are the 3 aspects that you focus on execution? Now, what struck me while you were going through one by one in the recap is, if I'm going to paraphrase, not even paraphrase, I list the 5 scenarios that you said. Now just put ones in the context of career strategy. You've been talking about business strategy and product strategy, but now all of us here in the audience, I want you guys to think about this from a career strategy, and it is no different. It is absolutely the same. I mean, look at it, right? Scenarios are your friends. Leverage your strengths and bet bold. Experiment in emerging spaces. Do things differently. Now, sometimes you could do different things as well, but doing things differently in where you are yields results as well. Don't stray too far. It's absolutely true, even when it comes to career strategy. At least that's my, interesting takeaway from everything that you mentioned, Neeraj. So, putting a different spin on it, but hopefully, that's relevant. Now, also, superb choice of movies, I must say. I can completely believe now, and there's a lot of favorites of mine there too. Brilliant case study. I think you kind of overlaid what you outlined before, with both the realistic case study as well as the hypothetical case study as well. I think this is, as I said, as specific, as clear as a class, right? And I'm sure many in the audience appreciate that. Now, I would just spend a minute or two to go through some of the questions. Now, there are questions that are coming in, but one request, Neeraj, if you have some time later, please take a few minutes to answer any questions that you see in the LinkedIn thread that some of the audience may have asked. Because we don't have necessarily time to go through all of these things. But Balasubramaniam asks, how do you suggest experimentation in a strategy? I mean, if you're building a product, you come with assumptions about the customer, market, product, define hypothesis, possibly define metrics to test. But in a strategy, how would we do this kind of experimentation? Isn't that too risky?
Well, my response to that is experimentation is the strategy. So it's for you to decide whether you have the risk appetite to experiment in these emerging spaces. So for example, like even in the real estate example, I deliberately chose something that came from the technology world because I hoped it would be relevant to this audience. Yeah. You're seeing it play out in real time with Zillow, and I'm sure this is a discussion their product managers and product leaders must have had when they started seeing this iBuying trend go up, which is, what do we do? Our entire website is currently tailored towards a traditional buying experience, but we're starting to see this thing happen. And so is it part of your strategic appetite to go ahead and make some investments and see whether this thing is going to work out for us or not? So I would actually, and I'm sorry, I'm being a little disingenuous and not directly answering your question, but I'm reframing the question and saying experimentation is the strategy.
Okay, no, that's a great answer. I think that helps put things in perspective and also look at it in a different way. Otherwise, we start equating how we do in products into this. If experimentation becomes your strategy, then you start thinking about risk appetite, evaluating those risks and whether you can take it or not. Super. Right. So I think that's, there are a few questions, but a lot of them are about, how this company could have done that and why didn't they do it. Now, I'm sure there are many case studies that are written about it, books written about it. One thing I wanted to ask is the framework that you mentioned, that you brought up, McKinsey thing. Is there a name for that framework so that our audience can go and probably look at it on the McKinsey website? Is there a name for the scenarios thing?
Oh, the scenarios was just, there were a couple of frameworks, not frameworks, but a couple of outputs from McKinsey that I shared. I think if this is the chart you're referring to.
The first one.
The first one.
Yes.
Yeah, well, there's no framework really. This is just McKinsey's ingenuity at work, where they've basically taken two factors and ended up creating scenarios manually. But the point I was making here is you could do the same in your particular industry. You could think about two different kinds of forces that are shaping your industry today, and think about what are the different levels or different, I would say levels. For example, here they say public health response, and the way McKinsey is thinking about this is better public health response versus worse public health response. So you could choose a factor relevant to your industry and create the same kind of quantization, if you will. So you could say there are 3 levels of this particular factor, and there are 2 levels of another factor that give you 6 different scenarios. So it's not really a framework set in stone.
Sorry, one could find this paper or blog post, whatever it is, on the net, I suppose, right?
I've actually added it in the source on this chart.
Okay, I'm sure we can get the link to that as well. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time, Neeraj, and joining us from your morning in the US. Shama, quickly over to you. Now, before we let you go, Neeraj, just hang on for a minute or so. One important thing, I want to encourage all the participants to join the product leaders community that, there are 1,000+ people now actively participating in discussions, sharing information, community.productleadersforum.org. You also have a mobile app to keep you, mobile, and of course get notified on interesting content there. The other important thing that I want to bring about is a community-driven initiative called the Product Leadership Benchmark Study. This is led by some of the IPL alumni and other community participants. This is essentially to do a baseline or benchmark of the state of product management and product leadership in this country. So, interesting.today/benchmark study is the URL. It'll take some time, so don't try it now. Maybe, after your dinner. Tomorrow is a holiday for many here. So do take that. Now, there are some benefits of participation. You will get a full report of this, where 5,000+ participants would take this study, which provides insights on salary, across level, career paths into product roles, actionable tips to excel in your product roles, understand a day in the life of a product leader, and of course, as HR or CXO, some insights from the participants on designing your product organizations, right? So please do take that survey. Again, Neeraj, appreciate you taking time. So as a token gesture, thank you. Please accept this digital certificate on our behalf. There is a dedicated page that's created for you with that QR code. And again, thanks so much. This was really, really interesting, and to me, at least, was enlightening. And I'm sure
I hope it was, and big thanks to the folks who stuck with it. I know there was a lot of content to cover, and I was very late back there, so I really appreciate you all taking the time. And thanks for having me here.